Ci sono un po' di tuoi studenti, Sergio?
Non credo.
Ok.
Di modo, anyway, I just want to tell Rachel and Robert that your book is included in the texts for our course in Verona. I have a course on history of economic development, and I thought it was very much suitable for our course. So, and the students have the book.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. And thank you for that introduction. That was really, that was very good.
I'm the most thankful to you. Yeah.
Okay, we can start. It is 8 o'clock. We will start with British precision. On behalf of the Center for Market Education and Taylor's University, a very warm welcome to all our attendees, but most particularly to our guests that accepted the invitation to speak at this very promising and exciting webinar. Later, I will introduce all of them one by one when is the moment for them to speak. I think that this is a very important topic to be discussed in the realm of Malaysia, where obviously where religion is a very important part of the political and economic society. And I think that discussing the book that Professor McCleary and Professor Barro co-authored in the context of an Islamic country is also probably a touch of novelty in the realm of this kind of debate, because when we discuss, as we will see in a short while, the main theories that have been developed by authors like Werner Zombart or Max Weber, usually we refer to which kind of Christian stream has mostly favored the Industrial Revolution and therefore economic development in the West. And the possible influence of different religions from Christianity on economic development is often disregarded in the debate. Instead, the book, The Wealth of Religions, that we are going to present tonight, is somehow filling that gap, because is touching not only Islam but also Buddhism and Hinduism. Allow me just to show. I think now okay. I have the cover here of the Italian edition. Okay, I'm reading in Italian. That was the Italian edition that was edited by Professor Noto, who is one of the speakers. And he has the English one. I have the Italian one. Perfect. For our attendees, tomorrow you will all receive an email, a thank email for having joined this event. And in the email, you will receive a discount code provided by Princeton University Press, which is the publisher of the book, that will grant you 30% discount of the online purchase of the book. So we want also to thank Princeton University Press for this. but without further ado, just allow me to pass the floor directly to Professor Anindita Dasgupta, who represents Taylor's University, who has been an academic partner for us since 2020, since we started our activity as a Center for Market Education. We have had other prestigious guests together, and I want to remember in particular Professor Peter Böttke from George Mason University and Professor David McCloskey from Chicago. We had very interesting webinars, and all the recordings of these webinars are available on our YouTube channel, so you are free to go explore and watch. Professor Anindita is an associate professor and the head of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and associate director of the Center for Asian Modernization Studies at Taylor University here in Malaysia. She's an historian by training and currently holds a visiting professorship at the University of Toulouse-Jean-Jaurès in France. So Anindita, the floor is yours for the opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Carmelo, for that very kind introduction. Esteemed guests, invited speakers, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening from Taylor's University in Malaysia. Now, with great delight, I note that this evening we have been joined by colleagues and students from various disciplinary backgrounds from different parts of the world. And I wish all of you an invigorating intellectual exchange over the next couple of hours. Do excuse me, I have a bit of bad throat today. It's my honor to present the introductory remarks at today's webinar titled Religion, Economics and Economies, which is co-hosted by the Center of Market Education, also known as CME, and the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Taylor's University. This is our third collaborative webinar, as Carmelo was sharing just now, and if surely not be our last. And it's the education mission of the Center for Market Education and Taylor's University that binds us together as we join hands to organize forums that analyze and reflect upon economic and social issues of imminent significance. And our collaborative webinars are also born out of the desire to highlight economics as a deeply human endeavor and to open conversations with disciplines like history, sociology, political science, and so on, and position it at the confluence of these varied disciplinary themes. So this evening, of course, we have a very eminent and global panel of speakers who I have no doubt you are greatly looking forward to hearing and whom Carmelo has promised to share with you the detailed introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, Taylor's University Malaysia is committed to a multi-perspective understanding of regional and global political, economic, social, and cultural issues to prepare our students to succeed. And we believe that our graduates require global perspectives, soft skills, creativity, business acumen, networks, and an entrepreneurial edge to not only achieve the career that they desire or aspire to, but also to carve a path for themselves by starting their own organizations and businesses, if they so choose. So to facilitate students acquiring these skills, the university has curated a Taylor Sphere ecosystem with the aim to nurture students' intellectual, mental, and emotional growth in an atmosphere of creativity and collaboration. And every student also takes up a course on social innovation in order to find solutions to real-world problems, realize their entrepreneurial dreams, and receive guidance with ideation, prototyping, funding, and product commercialization as well. So indeed, one of the 8 Taylor's graduate capabilities is entrepreneurialism. And I'm sure that our students, many of whom are here this evening, will be benefited from this evening's deliberations on what I believe is a new way, a very different, unique way of looking at entrepreneurialism, the links between religion and economies. Perhaps many of you, like me, were intrigued by the evocative title of the book under discussion today, The Wealth of Religions, one which instantly and very powerfully captures the imagination of the reader. Not surprisingly, of course, it takes one back to Adam Smith's 1776 book, Wealth of Nations, a book that had consumed so much of my own life as a student of history. And like most students of history, again, further drew me to Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism, which was perhaps the only book that I recall during my undergraduate days that, excuse me, linked religion and economics, where Weber made an argument for the importance of religion in contributing to capitalist culture. And several years back during my freshman year, and on the first day of class, a professor of British history had asked us this question, why was it that England was one of the first countries in Europe to adopt Protestantism as state religion? Something like that. And while none of us were quite able to answer that question on that first day at the university, it was his subsequent classes that opened up our minds to a holistic way of understanding and interpreting history, well beyond the proverbial dates, wars, and kings. And as we walked through, the intrinsic links between personal decisions of monarchs, personal decision of monarchs, and the new economic opportunities that allowed the outcomes of these decisions to sustain. Why did, for example, a war take place over an acquisition of a certain territory? And often the answer went back to the context of a scarce resources, like perhaps fertile river valleys that grew certain types of crops that were in high demand, or provided access to warm water port for trade, and so on. The links between religion and authority, between war and economic devastation, between peace and socio-economic prosperity, between conquest and wealth, between trade winds and merchandise, between science and business, were topics that often help us as young students of history then to explain historical transformation over the long durée. Ladies and gentlemen, closer home to Asia, and as Carmelo was just saying that, for the last 20 years, social science research has been developing in this part of the world to describe and interpret the ongoing transformations of Asian societies in the last 30 or 40 years under the name of compressed or compacted modernization, posited by sociologist Kyung-Suk Chang in 2010. These works seek to account for the fact that in the space of 1 or 2 generations, radical transformations have taken place in this part of the world, in the field of demography, consumption, living environments, urbanization, modes of travel and communication, which had been observed over a century and a half in the Western world. Malaysia, from where I speak, is a multicultural, multi-religious country that has been making huge strides in terms of economic development since the 1980s. So today, nearly a third of its population lives in globalizing cities like Kuala Lumpur, which have seen enormous growth in economic activities, including strengthening Malaysia's position as the global hub for halal products. So thus, from these vantage points, the relationship between religion and economy would be a fascinating topic and fertile ground for social scientists and entrepreneurs alike to explore. And with all this in mind, I greatly look forward to hearing today's discussions. In the words of the author, research that seeks to understand how religion influences and is influenced by economic, political, and social forces, close quote. Thank you so much, and back to you, Carmelo.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Anindita, and thanks to Taylor in general for having been once again our partner for such an interesting event. Now is the moment to go to the most important part of the webinar, so the presentation of the book, The Wealth of Religion, co-authored by Professor McCleary and Professor Barro, and published by Princeton University Press. Before a short introduction, I just like to remind our attendees that if they have any questions, they can type it in the Q&A box. So please not into the chat box, but into the Q&A. And later we will do our best to try to answer all the questions during the Q&A session. Now, what I found, if you allow me a brief introduction, what I found most interesting in the book is that I think can be conceived as a sort of second chapter after the seminal work of Max Weber on the topic, in the sense that somehow Max Weber, but also Werner Sombart later, and as Professor Noto reminds in the introduction of the Italian edition, the Italian school with Fanfani and Barbieri in particular, is the attempt to find into the into the philosophical beliefs, into the beliefs themselves, into the books, into the religious texts, a link that could spur economic development. So after this attempt, instead, the book that we discussed tonight tries to see in the facts if that link exists or not just as a philosophical discussion, not just as the speculative inquiry, but based on data and observation. Is indeed religion driving economic development, or is blocking it? What the facts, what the reality of the past 2 centuries tell us? And what I like, the perspective is not they don't simply look at any religion in particular, but they discuss the very fact of having religious belief. Is this an occasion for people to be more productive and therefore for a country to be more prosperous, or becomes an obstacle? And again, we could discuss this from a theoretical perspective for centuries, again, for another 2 centuries. But I think that the greatest added value that Professor McCleary and Professor Barro bring to the discussion is that they look into not what could be, but what was, what happened. So the link between the theoretical speculation and the historical observation of data. But of course, this is not my task to explain the book. We have here the authors that I briefly introduce you, but surely they don't need my introduction. So Professor Rachel McCleary, an associate at the economics department of Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Professor McCleary holds a doctorate in moral philosophy from the University of Chicago and a Master of Theological Studies from Emory Universities and a Bachelor of Arts at Indiana Universities. She has worked mostly to re-examine the role of religion and the influence of religious beliefs and practices on human productivity, economic growth, and the maintenance of political institutions such as democracy. Her scholarly work focuses in particular on moral agency, consciousness, and reasoning. Professor Barro, instead, is allow me to read the formal title, because he's Paul Warburg Professor of Economics at Harvard University. This is just the formal title, but I think everybody knows that Professor Barro is one of the founding pillars of new classical macroeconomics. I studied the works of Professor Barro when I was a student, so his name was mentioned on my textbook. That was not his macroeconomics textbook, but was the Dortmund Fischer Starts, mentioned in particular the works of Professor Barro on the theory of growth with relationship to the neoclassical production function. I think that his works are very well known. There is a theorem that brings his name, the theorem of Barro-Ricardo. And I think all the people among the attendees that had the luck or the misfortune of studying economics have encountered the name of Professor Barro sooner or later in their studies. Now, Professor McCleary and Professor Barro, the floor is yours. We are all eager to listen to your presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those introductions, and thank you for organizing this event and allowing us to talk to an audience that normally we wouldn't reach. So we certainly appreciate that very much. Our work is couched within the sociology of religion. And what we do is we begin with Adam Smith, obviously an economist, but his economic principles were taken by sociologists in the 60s to study cults. Well, what we do is we take 2 principles from Adam Smith. We take the market approach, supply and demand, that religion is a market, and that people are utility maximizers. So we also take the economic principle that they're rational actors, that they have interests, they have cost benefits. So in terms of the market, you might think of things like regulating religion, a state regulating religion. You might think of different types of organizational mechanisms to control the market. Adam Smith talked a lot about that. He also talked about homogeneity, civil rights, rule of law as having an impact on the flourishing of religion. And this would certainly be true in Islamic countries. What you mentioned earlier about the state regulating religion and how that plays out in terms of participation. The second principle is rational actor. We argue that in fact, people do make rational choices about religion, that they do understand the cost-benefit analysis of believing certain beliefs and participating in certain organizations. If it becomes too costly, they'll probably opt out or lower their participation. We're also really interested in what kinds of goods those religious organizations and those beliefs produce. So our work is really focused, unlike sociologists, on clubs and social organization. We're focused on beliefs. How do beliefs increase religious participation or contribute to the flourishing of religion or the decline of religion, the limiting of religion, what some people call the dark side of religion? The other leg of our research is Max Weber. So in order to understand beliefs, we introduced Max Weber's theory. Max Weber basically relied on the Protestant Reformation, and he argued that with the aesthetic pietistic approach to religion, in which you had epistemological uncertainty about whether you were going to be saved, then you worked harder because you needed a sign that you were going to be saved. So that inculcates a certain amount of belief. You're believing and you're working hard because you want to be saved. The motivation is what we call salvific merit. You want to go to heaven, you don't want to go to hell. So what happens with Luther is Luther comes along and he says, well, you know, it isn't just about doing religious activities, which is what the pietists argued. You spent your whole life involved in religious activity. Martin Luther came along and he said, that's really selfish for you to spend your life in a monastic community or a closed religious community, wasting all your resources within those sacred activities. So Luther opened it up and he said, ordinary work has value and it's motivated by religious beliefs and morality. So he opened up this whole can of worms, so to speak. So ordinary work then, not just religious activity, had salvific merit. Now, the hinge here is that you don't know if you're going to be saved. So then the question becomes, you're working really hard to figure out how you're going to be saved, if this is going to be a sign that you're going to be saved. So it inculcates hard work, honesty, thrift, all these values that capitalism, that a market enjoys when it wants to be fruitful and productive. So Martin Luther then comes along and introduces that, but then Max Weber says those theological underpinnings are then lost. As capitalism takes hold, the Industrial Revolution takes hold, those types of underpinnings are gone away. So these are the motivations, the analytical motivations for our work on the economics of religion. These are kind of the theoretical underpinnings that drive how we look at religions in different contexts.
So let me say in a general way that religion and political economy has become quite a vibrant field within economics over the last 20 years or so. So this is something which I found quite surprising from an earlier perspective. One indicator of the seriousness to which economists and other social scientists are taking religion in this context is that the journal, Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is the Harvard Journal, recently had a special issue comprised of 15 major articles that appeared in the journal since 2005. So it's quite extraordinary that so many papers in this top journal would be in the field of religion and economy. Maybe along the same lines, Rachel and I have been teaching a course on religion and political economy at the undergraduate level for some years, and I think it's been very successful. We've also run a research seminar on religion and economy for some time. And we're planning in the future to expand that to include more diverse elements of culture, along with religion, bring a prominent example related to culture. So as Anindita said, I mean, this is part of this development where culture is being taken more seriously as a part of economics and social science more broadly. So the book that we have covers a variety of topics related to religion and economy. So it's not a treatment of the whole field by any means, but it's more trying to go into some depth on various areas in which there have been some important developments over the last 10 to 20 years in particular. So Carmelo mentioned that in some sense we were the descendants of Max Weber, which I readily embrace. In fact, I think we're really more Weberian than Weber, as we note at some point in the book, in the sense that he thought that his theory was mostly important during the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath of that. He didn't think it was relevant anymore in the late 19th century when he was writing his book. But we take his ideas more seriously than that, and we try to apply the reasoning and the hypotheses that come from that to more modern data. And I think we've had some success along those lines. So one of the features that we stress in the book, particularly in the early parts of the book, is this two-way causation between religion and economy. So the Weberian channel is about religion mattering for outcomes, including economic growth and other kinds of results. So as I think most people know, Weber stressed that certain religious-oriented beliefs, we emphasize work ethic, thrift, honesty, aspects of charity perhaps could be added to that, that those character traits underlie productivity aspects that were particularly helpful during the Industrial Revolution, which was Weber's stress, but we think it still matters. So initially this came out at the time of the Reformation, the period that Weber was particularly looking at, but we try to look at that also, as I said before, with respect to modern data. Other people have argued that not so much beliefs, but religious participation, gauged by things like attendance at religious services, are especially important, particularly in the context of forming social capital that might underlie productivity and economic growth. That's not the aspect that we stress in our research. We find more that there's a channel whereby the religious beliefs are the most important. And in some cases, we argue it's something like believing relative to belonging that actually matters in terms of enhancing economic growth. So if you have some countries where religion might not be all that vibrant, like Scandinavian countries, but religious beliefs are high in comparison with participation, which is basically nil, then we think that's a pattern that actually is encouraging to economic outcomes. Similarly, in some communist countries, which tried to basically wipe out organized religion, it was still likely the case that beliefs were high in comparison with the low levels of participation. And that's, again, a pattern which is actually positive in terms of economic outcomes. It's also true that religious participation clearly uses up a lot of resources, a lot of time. So that can be a negative dimension. Another dimension, which was already mentioned, I think, by Carmelo, is that religions matter for things like laws, regulations, and so on. Timur Kuran, who has particularly studied Islam in relation to political economy, has argued that this is a big negative dimension, and he particularly looks at areas, not only credit markets, which are the traditional emphasis, but also corporate structure, insurance, inheritance law. He's argued that those were big negative dimensions that underlie why Muslim countries, which initially were ahead of the West, subsequently fell behind. This is Timur Karan's basic idea. Of course, other dimensions of laws and regulations have to do with family matters, particularly fertility and rules about marriage and such. And those can be additional dimensions whereby religious sponsored laws and regulations can have a negative impact. If you think about the overall impact of religion on economic growth, there are really effects that go in different directions. So our idea about believing relative to belonging, typically those things move together. Typically places with a lot of belief also have a lot of participation and vice versa. So in our framework, that kind of nets out and doesn't really predict that more or less religious places, without making this finer distinction, actually have a big growth impact. And another dimension of that, if you think about Weber, about Protestantism versus Catholicism, if you look at the major OECD countries, some of which are primarily Protestant and some primarily Catholic, the difference in standard of living, although it's present among those countries, is not that great. So even the major Catholic countries, such as Italy, Spain, France, are not that far behind the major Protestant countries, notably most of Germany and the UK. So it can't be that that's such a defining difference in terms of long-run economic development. So I mentioned there was this two-way direction of causation. The other is about economic development having impact on religiosity. This is part of this more broad modernization idea, which is associated especially with Karl Marx, which has to do with some kind of determinism from economic outcomes to these other actions, in this case, something about religiosity. So one famous dimension of this is the secularization hypothesis, the idea that as economies develop, which means they get richer, but also more educated, fertility rates likely go down, life expectancy goes up. There's several, urbanization also expands. So there are several dimensions about economic development, but the overall idea is that in combination, they result in less religion, whether it's in terms of participation or beliefs, or about religion influencing the role of government policy in societies, some of which has to do with the functioning of state religions. So in our work, we find some evidence for that, particularly urbanization is very much negatively related with religiosity. And we think that's because in urban areas, there are a lot of alternatives to formal participation in religion, church going. It's also true that the uncertainty about economic life in cities might be less than that in rural areas where you're dependent on vagaries of agriculture. And that might in turn lead to less demand for religion, if religion is a way of dealing with uncertainty in particular. We also find that higher life expectancy is associated with less religiosity, and that fits in with some theories in which people are seeking salvation or some kind of sign of being saved as part of what they're doing with respect to religious activity. Anyway, we find overall that there's some evidence for greater economic development to lead to less religiosity, but it doesn't show up at all as religion basically disappearing. And certainly you find examples of wealthy countries which are still highly religious, including the United States, but also places like Poland, Ireland would be additional examples of that. Another area of research that we look at, which Rachel's already mentioned a bit, is this religion market model, which comes from the work of Adam Smith. So the idea there is that when religion is less competitive, maybe enhanced by the presence of state religion, tends to become more of a monopoly. Prices tend to go up, thinking of prices in a general sense. Service quality tends to go down, and people respond by participating less in formal religion. That was what was in the Adam Smith argument, and that's been also in some more modern work. So as Carmela mentioned, we try to look at these various ideas in a quantitative context using various sources of data across countries and over time. We particularly rely on some major survey instruments, notably the World Values Survey and the ISSP, which include information for many individuals about attendance at formal religious services, and also about an array of religious beliefs, including things like whether you believe in hell and heaven, afterlife more broadly. We also use data that come initially from Barrett. He initially called it the World Christian Encyclopedia, but now it's referred to as the World Religion Database. So that has a lot of information, particularly about patterns of adherence. So that's a part of the book that we look at, is on the topics that I just outlined. I might just mention quickly, without any details, that Rachel and I have done work on saints, about the Catholic Church choosing people who are beatified and canonized and become blessed persons within the context of the church. We had a paper on that a few years ago, and now we're expanding that research, and we're distinguishing between ordinary saints and martyrs who died as part of persecution aimed at the Catholic Church itself. We're trying to test the hypothesis now that this saint making is a device that the church uses as a competitive strategy, particularly to avoid conversions out of Catholicism and into what has become the major alternative, which is evangelical Protestantism. So we're trying to assess first whether the church acts this way. That was particularly in our earlier paper. And secondly, if it does, is it successful or unsuccessful? And does the creation of more blessed persons increase the enthusiasm of the Catholic faithful, and therefore keep them within the church rather than departing to some alternative religion? So I hope that conveys some flavor of the work that we've been doing. And of course, there's a lot more detail within the book. Okay.
Thank you very much for having so effectively summarized the contents of the book, and I hope that all the attendees felt inspired and that they got the desire to buy and read the book. I found a very interesting reading. I had chance to read it to prepare this webinar, and I found it a very interesting companionship along my evenings in the past 2 or 3 weeks. Now I will introduce you the discussants for this webinar, for this session, and allow me to introduce them firstly by mention why I'm personally happy to have them both here tonight. So I would like to start with personal rememberings, personal memories, and after that to explain why they are very highly qualified to be the discussants of this session. First of all, I would not be here without Professor Noto. Professor Noto was my History of Economic Thought teacher in 2001, University of Verona, when my most audacious dream was to become an accountant. And then thanks to that class, I discovered that were probably more interesting careers ahead. And from there, I developed a very peculiar personal path. So somehow there would not be an interest in economics in me without Professor Noto. And Professor Noto not only made me read those economists that later on became very much important for my own elaboration, like Schumpeter and Hayek, but also introduced me to the works of Robert Barro and to the issues of economics and religion as well. In 2002, together we hosted a seminar at the University of Verona with Michael Novak, the late Michael Novak, discussing the Catholic ethics and the spirit of capitalism. And then Ali Salman has been with me in Malaysia for more or less 2-3 years. I met him in Malaysia when I was back from very tiring medical conditions and a few months in Italy, and our paths crossed each other. And in a moment that was very dramatic for my own health and for my career, because I was risking to compromise as well my career because of medical issues, he asked me to write something that had no actual connection with my past studies, both in terms of topic and in terms of methodology. But somehow I managed to be miraculously successful with that paper, and that paper somehow launched my career as an economist here in Malaysia. So later on, it was Ali that pushed me to create the Center for Market Education. He's also one of the co-founder. So CME would not exist without Ali. And also on a personal level, he's Muslim, I'm Catholic. Let's say this conversation about the role of religions in our lives, in our professional careers, and etc., has been part of our, let's say, personal conversation, a part of our friendship path in the respect of the distinct religious beliefs, but trying to somehow be enriched from each other. And I always perceived a path of enrichment thanks to the friendship with Ali. Now Ali is back in Pakistan, but he has been an essential part of my life in Malaysia, probably the most important one, I would say, or one of the most significant people for me here in Malaysia. Now, to close the personal parenthesis, why these two discussants? Let's start with Professor Noto. Professor Noto, I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction the Italian school on the studies on the relationship between economics and religion, and in particular the seminal work by Amintore Fanfani that challenged somehow the works of Max Weber. And one of the main followers, disciples, academic disciples of Fanfani was Barbieri, Gino Barbieri, that founded the Department of Economic History at the University of Verona. And Professor Noto is the last descendant of that school somehow, if I may, the youngest and last descendant of the school of Gino Barbieri. So he has a personal interest in the relationship between economics and religion. He has studied liberal authors like Hayek or Passerelle and Trev, but lately his research has focused on the concept of corporatism. Corporatism has recently always been associated to the way in which it developed under the fascism, but indeed it emerged firstly and foremost during the Middle Age as the organizational way for the economy of people with a certain set of religious beliefs. So I would say that in the Middle Age, corporatism has been the spontaneous order generated by Catholic beliefs for the economic system. And instead, Ali Salman is a political economist based in Pakistan, is the head of the Prime Institute, a very prestigious think tank in Pakistan, but is also the CEO of the Islam and Liberty Network, a global platform advancing the understanding of religious, political, and economic freedom in Muslim-majority countries. And very recently, he has also published a book on the topic. So the book is titled Islam and Economics, a primer on markets, morality, and justice. I don't know if you can see here the cover. And has been published by the Acton Institute is obviously an institute in the US very much attentive relationship between economics and religion. So Ali, I will give the floor to you first to close later in beauty with Professor Noto.
Well, wow, thank you, Carmelo. I'm not sure where to start after a very personal and touching introduction, and indeed a very enlightening introduction of their book by Professor Barro and Professor Rachel. I had an opportunity of reading parts of the book, a very fascinating account on the subject, and I must confess I paid more closer attention to the chapter on Islam. And I believe that I know a little bit about that. And so I thought that maybe with the objective of contributing to this important topic, I will say a few things. And I'll also touch upon basic ideas in my book. But first, let me also thank again Carmelo, CME, and Anindita Taylor's University for organizing this. I'm very pleased to see the outreach of the webinar, and I hope that this will lead to more interesting conversations. So I think what the book highlights is one of the fundamental features of our age, and tries to also uncover the impact with the impact of religion on development, particularly from the belief point of view, as Professor Barro rightly highlighted. And you mentioned, Professor Barro, about the assumption being rational actors. I think that's an important one. And you are aware, I'm sure you are aware of a very rich discussion which has gone in the Islamic discourse on the compatibility between the rationality and the belief, or sometimes, so there are various schools of thoughts which emerged over the last few centuries. Some schools were more attached to the rational explanation of the doctrinal message of Quran, whereas some schools attached to more conservative and more belief-oriented literal interpretation of the text. And this discussion is not over. As I think Carmelo mentioned, in the context of Malaysia, the religion and Islam in particular still plays a significant role in the public debate in most of the Muslim majority countries. Pakistan is one of them, Iran, Saudi, Indonesia. So you mentioned many large, think of the large countries, you will see Islam being relevant there. And that is also, I think, a bit different from, let's say, the Western countries, where I believe a public reference to religion in the matters of policy and politics is not that paramount, whereas in our context, it is still very much relevant. So I'm pleased that this discussion is happening. And this has, the understanding of religion, in this case, an understanding of Islam itself, has deep implications for the policy choices and for the political affiliation in these countries. Just to give one example, in North Africa, Tunisia, which happened to be the only successful example of the Arab Spring democratization movement. It was led by a scholar of Islam who founded a political party, and whose belief on a political moderation, on democracy, you have a profound impact on that society. And even today, he is the main sort of reference point in many political debates, not just in Tunisia, but also around Muslim countries. So I think the issue of interpretation of religion is very much alive and relevant in in these societies. And I also like to say something on the understanding of economics in the context of Islamic thought. Particularly, I would say that it's very interesting actually, and I have studied presented a chapter on this in my book, that how the earlier understanding of economic system or economic policies in the classical Islamic scholars, is different from what I will call modern understanding of economics in the, let's say, in last 100 years, especially when we hear about the subject of Islamic economics, Islamic finance, Islamic banking. A lot of that comes not from a positive contribution to the subject of economics, but it comes largely from the idea of, let me say, rejection of what they call Western imperial capitalist systems. And so they're not suggesting anything, most of them, on their own, but they started this intellectual journey 100 years ago, which coincided with the anti-colonization political movements in most of the Muslim countries or Muslim lands. Which obviously after the Ottoman Empire, they became countries, but there were large parts of the Muslim majority lands at that point in time. And so if you read the classical text, let's say early 500 years, 700 years of the Islamic scholars, Imam, or as we call them, you see a noticeable difference in their understanding of economics. So in my book, I refer to, for instance, discussion on price freedom, which goes back to the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him himself, who actually was against any kind of price control. And how this hadith, his saying, was later a subject of a very rich scholarly debate within the Muslim scholars, that why price controls are bad, and what kind of problems can it lead to. But these discussions, those philosophical discussions in the modern era of this subject called Islamic economics, unfortunately diminished. We don't see those debates anymore, but rather a debate on, let's say, Islamic banking, very narrow focus on finding an alternative monetary system, and a banking system in particular, the discussion on usury. So those discussions became paramount in the modern discourse, and the classical discussions on the institutions of the economy got faded away. I give up, just to give you a small reference, I talk about, for instance, a principle and how one of the classical scholars of Islamic time, Imam Ghazali, almost neatly defined the idea of comparative advantage many centuries before Ricardo would do it. And how and how, for instance, and this was acknowledged by your contemporary Dr. Arthur Leffer, that how he was inspired by Ibn Khaldun for his Leffer curve. So Leffer curve goes back to the ideas of Muqaddimah, which he read, and obviously he draw a nice graph, which was still not available to Ibn Khaldun at that time, about 700 years ago. And so when you come across these modern discussions in the Islamic context, you don't find them anymore. So I'm trying to rediscover in my work how they are connected, and more importantly, what contribution can we make in the contemporary discussion and challenges of economy, challenges of equity, climate change. These are very important topics of our time, and whether these insights, which are based on religious belief, for instance, the issue of property rights. And I talk about property rights in my work, how a sort of a classification of private property rights has policy implications for the societies which would like to follow them. I do recognize, I think you wrote in your book, and you also mentioned in your initial comments about the fascinating and very important work of Taimur Quran. And I recognize that he has expressed and he has sort of been quite critical of the lack of evolution of institutions with Islamic history. And I think I recognize that that has been a part of the problem. But I would also like to mention another reference, a book which was published about 5 years ago. This book is called, the author is Benedict Kohler. He's a German economic historian. And the title of the book is Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. So in this book, which is very unique in the sense that Benedict Kohler is tracing the evolution of the institution of capitalism in the early to middle ages of Islamic expansion, and how nowhere but actually in Italy, the intersection between the Arab traders and the European traders were to later lay the foundation of venture capital, of modern trade instruments, and you have many of these interesting institutional developments. So I think Taimur Quran is important, but is also a different reading of the history, which we also need to recognize. The institution of Waqf, the private charitable foundation, has played an important role in development. Taimur Quran is quite critical of it, but then there's also this view that it has also played a role in the socio-economic development of Muslim societies, importantly away from the state, and more driven in the individual enterprise, more driven to the, let's say, the protection of the family, certainly the state was I think had lesser power in that context. So these are my broad thoughts. I think commenting on your significant work in my own book. I'm not going to go into that detail, but I talk about how, for instance, a balance of economic freedom and consumer protection can be achieved. Even I go to the extent of policies like, why an Islamic system of economy would prefer a lower and flatter taxation system and minimal tariffs. What is the religious argument behind it? And actually, just to mention Taimur Quran again, he wrote a recent article which was published about 2 years back on zakat, the Islamic tax. And he wrote that had Muslim societies understood zakat properly, not as a poor due, but as a proper fiscal policy, we would have seen very sort of an indigenous development of limited government ideas in Muslim societies, which did not happen. But he is reading again into how zakat, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, could be or still can be used to restrain the government, in a social context. And then I mentioned some of the institutions like inheritance, and how, for instance, it is ensuring distribution of wealth, intergenerational distribution of wealth. And there cannot be, in my view, any inheritance tax in Islamic society, because state cannot inherit a property from an individual. At the same time, of course, the other view is that it actually discourages accumulation of wealth. But then the Islamic principle is more of a circulation. So I think there are these tensions which are important to to recognize, and I mentioned to in a talk some of them. But again, I mean, as compared with your work, my work is mostly theoretical in nature. I've not done much of empirical research. Hopefully, maybe one day. But again, I congratulate you for your fascinating work and look forward to this discussion and learning from all of you. Thank you. Over to you, Carmelo.
Thank you very much, Ali. And in fact, if at the beginning I mentioned that the book by McCleary and Barro can be considered as volume 2 of the Protestant Ethics of Max Weber, so the quantitative part in a way, I think that your work is the attempt to bring that way in which Weber was reasoning, so the Weber way of thinking, into the Islamic context. So I think that your work is a seminal under this perspective, and hopefully can pave the way for further studies. And I'm glad that you mentioned also the intersections with Italy, and we have briefly discussed this a few months ago. If we look at the history of Sicily, to which I'm particularly interested because of my origins, we all know that Sicily had more or less a couple of centuries of Arabic domination, and is very interesting to see how enlightened from the policy perspective was the Arabic domination in Sicily, and how there was probably a practical understanding of the dynamics of the market into the Arabic populations that actually the North African populations that colonized Sicily, that all the policies that were introduced were aiming and producing more wealth rather than deprive Sicily of its natural wealth, like many subsequent dominations will try to do instead, considering really Sicily as a colony. So Sicily was less of a colony under the Arabic domination than in different circumstances, and I invite you probably to try to work on these more in the future as a part of a practical research for you, Ali. So working on my beloved Sicily. So now it's time to pass the floor to Professor Noto for his considerations.
Carmelo, thank you very much. Thank you very much for arranging this webinar. Thank you very much to Rachel and Robert Barro for their outstanding book. You know, I would have many points to focus, but I must go back to one that I consider the most important contribution of this book. I want to be very straight, maybe a bit rude, but I have to say that this is a revolutionary book, and I will try to explain briefly as I consider this book indeed a revolutionary book for economics and for philosophy. You know, it's not, of course, the case of our authors, but we must admit that most of the modern economists doesn't know much about history of economic thought, and so in many cases they have the very frequent failure of that, for example, Mises pointed out for Keynes. He didn't know something about Knut-Wicksell. So in many cases, a good knowledge of the past economics avoid many failures. And a good starting point is in the book, and I suppose in the mind and the ideas of Rachel, that the beginning of economics is grounded on Adam Smith. economic as a science, and the book begins with Adam Smith. So as we know, Adam Smith was firstly a philosopher, a moral thinker, and so we must admit that economics is a kind of a rib of philosophy, and this is the first reason why the book is so revolutionary, because the book discussing on religion indeed is discussing of the basis of economics, and the fact that religion is influencing, and they have the positive opportunity, the concrete opportunity to demonstrate that the religion influences very much economic development. This is I consider this is a structural change in our view of considering economics. Vilfredo Pareto, who is probably the most or one of the most important for sure between Italian economists, but he realized that religion was very much important. But since his frame was a positive frame, he considered religion as a non-rational actions. Are rational actions, and so because his idea of rationality is the traditional idea of rationality as something that is negative, that drive to negative situation, to wrong decision, and since we must admit that non-rational decisions are not only very relevant in economics, but probably are the most relevant in economics, and that religion must be considered within the frame of non-rational decision, we have to change our idea of rationality and our idea of non-rationality. So non-rational decisions are not only so much important, but the conclusion, the end of non-rational decision often is better than rational decision. So this is the revolution, that if we keep on consider economic as a kind of fake of rational decision only, you know, I think that we remain in the gate of this, stuck in the gate of this situation that is as everybody realize is a blocked situation on economic thinking in the 21st century. So the contribution of religion in economics is able to change our view, our sight of economics. Is not only it's also a contribution, is a part of the picture, but is the path to change our completely our view on economics. Economics is on the way to be considered a non-rational science, as most of the issues that determines economic choices are not rational. And this is what I learned firstly from this book, that economics is every day a more complicated pattern, a more complicated system, and we have no easy solution to economic problems, and we have no only formal solution, only logical solution, as economics is based on women and men that are mostly determined by non-rational goals. And so I think that I don't know if right now many economists will realize how much important is this contribution of Robert Barro and Rachel McCleary. I don't know, but I'm not also very much interested in this. But I'm sure that it opens a new era for economic thinking, as we have. I think that mostly we have realized in this period that economics has to be rebirthed. And this is a contribution to rebirth economics, to make economics something that is indeed suitable for person. And so I'm most of thankful. And the question that I would like to submit to Robert and to Rachel is, are you aware of this, the risk of this, of the consequences of your contribution? Thank you very much, and sorry for to be too long.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And now I think before we open to the Q&A, Sergio has touched a very important issue, the issue of rationality, which I'm not sure if the problem is, I mean, this we could talk forever, is of rationality versus non-rationality, or the problem is of expanding the meaning of rationality, which probably is also an attempt. I'm reading in this period a very interesting book by Matthew Posvanch, The Evolutionary Invisible Hand, The Problem of Rational Decision Making and Social Ordering Over Time, that draws a lot from the concept of kaleidhic society in George Shackle, the impossibility of predicting the future in Ludwig Lachmann, and etc. So the issue of rationality and how religion can be part of a different concept of rationality, or if religion is indeed opposed to rationality, I think would be another very interesting topic of discussion. But again, before we open the floor for the Q&A, I was wondering if Professor McCleary and Barro would like to comment on Ali and Sergio discussion.
Well, I'd like to comment on Sergio's point, which I think is very well taken. And I think I agree with him that many people who, particularly social scientists, miss this point in our book. I would liken it to the fact, or I would explain it by the fact that we are post-Enlightenment. And Immanuel Kant had a lot to do with how we understood ethics. And so the idea is that Immanuel Kant argued that not only are we rational beings, but that is an end in itself. So not only is it the means, but it's the end. So he was deontological. He was very absolutist in that sense. Whereas what we're arguing is quite different. We're arguing that rationality is a means, but not a means to a rational end, so to speak. It is a means to something that you cannot prove or disprove. It's the means of salvation, the means of believing in God, and the ordering tends to be morality and religious beliefs and other types of things like Sagat, and other types of charitable giving that all enter into how we rationally organize the religion. So that would be my response to Sergio. I agree with him. And I think it's underestimated. That's an underestimated aspect of our book. I don't know that Robert would agree with it, but I'm the philosopher, so I'm going to say that.
Okay. Okay, that it?
Go ahead.
So let me respond in a few ways on a few points. Carmelo again raised the idea that we were the followers of Max Weber, which I readily embrace. And some empirical evidence to that effect is that Weber is by far the most cited person in our book. Related to that, Lawrence Iannacone is the economist who has particularly prominent examples of the first development of economic models related to religion. And he turned out to be the second most cited person in our book. And Larry was very pleased when we told him he was the second most cited and only second to Max Weber. And he said he was very happy to come after Weber, that was an excellent position for him to be in. So let me react to some points from Ali first. I wanted first to recognize that I think we need more knowledge on our part about the longer term development of Islam in relation to economics and legal provisions. And I look forward to looking at Ali's own work and to the Kohler book, which I think we could learn from. In terms of Timur Kuran's work, we found it very persuasive. I think one shortcoming, which is partly related to the possibility of data, is that it's not very quantitative. It makes some convincing impressionistic cases about the impact of especially institutional features related to Islam and long-term economic development. Now, one thing there I found particularly convincing was that his stress on corporate structure and how that was impossible or difficult to maintain within the Muslim system was something that became much more important after the Industrial Revolution, when it was important to have a certain scale of enterprise and a more complex enterprise involving more strangers as part of the business, and that was less important before. And from that comes the result that Muslim countries would be predicted to fall behind, especially after the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about from, let's say, 1600 to 1900 or something like that. And it's consistent with the fact that Muslim countries were more advanced in much earlier times. So that was one dimension of Timur's argument that I found kind of persuasive. So Sergio mentioned the importance of knowing about history of economic thought. Ali particularly related this to Ricardo. I was quite disturbed to learn that comparative advantage had been invented by an Islamic scholar well before Ricardo. So this reminded me of some other experience. I wrote a paper that subsequently became known as Ricardian equivalence. This goes back very many years. But the truth was, when I wrote this paper, I had no idea about what Ricardo had done on this subject. And then James Buchanan said that, well, this idea is Ricardian equivalence. It comes from Ricardo, and particularly a pamphlet that he wrote about public debt, which is much better than his major book on this point. So when Buchanan raised that, I thought it would be easy for me to find something before Ricardo that had already mentioned it, because I thought you could always go back earlier and find some germ of the idea that you were trying to examine. So I spent a lot of time doing that, starting with Adam Smith and other precursors of Ricardo. And I actually could not find any coherent expression of something that looked like Ricardian equivalence earlier. So this was a sort of violation of this general idea that you can always find something earlier. And then, in fact, in a subsequent column, I said, well, we should call this Ricardian equivalence. And then after that, kind of everybody agreed that that's the way it would be called. It's also related to what's known as Stigler's law, which is the idea that nothing is ever named after the person who actually invented it. And that's also true for Stigler's law, which was supposed to be cute. But maybe Ricardian equivalence is also a violation of that, because it seems like Ricardo really does deserve the credit there. So I wanted to say some things about rationality that Sergio was emphasizing, and that Rachel also reacted to, and probably have a different view about this. First, I don't know that religion itself is an example of irrational behavior. I wouldn't say that in the main. A lot of it is based on non-verifiable beliefs, which I don't think holding those is necessarily irrational. But more generally in economics, there has been an expansion of work that embraces the idea that decision-making is based on a lot of non-rational principles, and that's usually called behavioral economics. And this area has become extremely popular at Harvard and at other places. I don't think this is such a great development, frankly. The real power of economics is that it has a framework that allows you to make some predictions, which may or may not be verified, for example, with data. And that's mostly based on the idea that people are rational and they're maximizing something. And that gives you a concrete basis for predicting how you respond to something or other, like a change in prices or income, for example. When you give that up, you tend to open the door to almost anything goes. And that's not a very good position, even though behavioral elements may be relevant. For me, although I think some of the behavioral economics ideas are useful, I think in the main, you want to try to explain things within a rational framework and go as far as you can along those lines before you would instead resort to this idea of people being irrational. So I think an example of that from my own work from the last 10 plus years is about rare macroeconomic disasters, which has to do with the fact that people worry about low probability but very consequential events. The Great Depression, some major wars, the recent COVID-19 crisis. Now, an implication of that is that people do take account of these low probability events when they make choices. And that can be a basis for explaining some prices and rates of return that you see in the real world, in particular, the big gap between the average return on stocks and the very low return on safe assets. So I think absent this rare disaster perspective, there was a tendency to label all of that as irrational. Why would people give up the high average return on stocks and earn a very low return on safe assets? Over the long run, it seems like you must be better off by putting everything into the high yielding stocks. Well, I think that's just mistaken. And it's mistaken within a context of rational agents. So that's just an example of a case where I think a quick reaction would have been to resort to irrationality, and where I think it turned out not to be necessary. So I would be very cautious about going too far down the road of embracing behavioral elements which featured a kind of irrationality that I think, if I understood it, Sergio was trying to embrace, and predicting would become more and more important in terms of the way the professions work.
Well, I think another point to be made that we touch on but we don't discuss is the idea of heterogeneity. And sometimes that appears to be irrationality. And this was something that the sociologists Rodney Stark and Block in the 1960s were interested in explaining as to why people joined cults that had nothing to do with their background, were just foreign ideas. You had these Protestant Christians who were joining these Maharishis and these extreme cults and engaging in these activities. To the outsider, it looks like irrationality, but they were able to explain how these individuals were making rational choices. They don't explain beliefs, but they're actually interested in explaining choice and how they are motivated to join this to get certain benefits, to avoid free ridership, higher participation in a good, have more people singing and clapping. You don't have people free riding, and you get that religious high. So I think that I see it that way. That's one way in which this is discussed. But I also, and I don't know if this was Sergio's intent originally, but that was my first comment, was that I do think, like Aristotle, that something like happiness, which is an intangible thing, you can't prove or disprove. It's very elusive. Okay, salvation is that way. Belief in God is that way. Belief in angels or what have you are intangibles in that sense that some might say that they're irrational. But in fact, you can't prove or disprove them. And they do motivate. They're high motivators for people. It motivates their behavior, and then they have rationality to organize that behavior. We can also talk about extreme groups in Islam, which people, Ellie Berman and others have studied, arguing that they're irrational. But in fact, when you look at their behavior, it's not irrational. You can explain it in some sense. I don't know if this touches on what Sergio meant, but anyway.
I agree that this club model approach is an important example of another set of phenomena which can be explained under the rational behavior rubric rather than resorting to this irrational explanation. So I readily accept that. This club model approach was, I think, the most important contribution that came from Jan Economies, whom I already mentioned.
Thank you very much for this exciting exchange of opinions, and again, the issue of rationality, I think, remains very open. And personally, I tend to embrace the, if you want, light concept that Ludwig von Mises suggested, that is every agent acts in order to move from a situation of uneasiness toward a situation in which he or she is better off, and whatever it means. And the identification of a situation of being better off is very personal, and this doesn't mean that the choices that we make in order to achieve that being better off are the right ones. We can judge them only ex post somehow, according to the outcome. But in the moment in which we take that decisions, we are rational because the decision we take is consistent with the content of knowledge that we have available at that moment. So we don't act against ourselves, but that being better off is ultimately very subjective, and therefore Mises explicitly contemplate also the fact that we look for religious satisfaction and spiritual satisfaction. So it doesn't necessarily mean any material satisfaction. So in this sense, I think the concept of rationality is broad, as indeed Aristotle taught us. But I think my opinion on this is very limited, and I think unimportant. Before opening the Q&A, I would just like to thank some of the people that I can see present among the attendees. And first of all, His Excellencies Pascal Grégoire, Ambassador of the Kingdom of Belgium in Malaysia. Thank you very much, His Excellency, to be here. Then I've seen Dr. Sumita from Inti College, Professor Renato Lima from the Asia School of Business, which is a campus organized in cooperation with the MIT here in Malaysia. And I have seen also Professor John Harn from the London Institute of Banking and Finance. So thanks for these prestigious attendees of having found the time to be with us today. Now I would open the floor, so feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box. I can see we already have some questions. I would start with the last that I see here in the box, that is indeed from Professor Hahn from London. And he says, most interesting and many thanks. In discussing economic growth with my graduates and undergraduates, we often consider the impact of gender discrimination, particularly against women achieving their full potential in various cultures and religions. and its effect on the efficient allocation of resources. Will they find any comfort in your research? Please unmute yourself.
I know there are some works in economic development that suggest that various ways of improving opportunity for women has positive effects on results, partly in terms of the political process and partly in terms of treatment related to the workforce. We don't ourselves have results on empirical determinants of economic growth that isolate these kinds of factors, but there's nothing in principle that argues against examining that further. And it's conceivable that if we have good measures about opportunity related to women versus men, that we could find some effects, but I don't have results on that at the moment.
Well, the other thing that you have to consider is the gender roles for women within a religion and what that will do in terms of participation in a religion. For example, in looking at the Catholic Church, which we've done in quite a bit of detail, we have data sets on confessors and martyrs. We find that the standard of virtue is very gender specific. So the Catholic Church, even though Pope Francis is trying to open up the Catholic Church more for women short of ordination, he's trying to find, and deaconship, he's trying to find larger roles for them. The concept of virtue, of getting into heaven and being a saint, is still very traditional in terms of a woman being a mother and having children and within the domestic realm. Now, this is a serious contradiction for Francis, that the Catholic Church is trying to retain members while not yet rethinking the virtue role for women and how they can attain sainthood.
Maybe I could ask Ali a question related to this. In part of our work, partly in terms of understanding the main survey data that are available for Muslim countries, we had a difficult time in interpreting the differences in religious participation for men versus women, which I think relates in part to how women, if they do at all, attend formal religious services in Muslim countries. And I believe that varies a lot from country to country. So I didn't know whether you could educate us more along these lines in terms of what you know about this.
Thank you. I think this has actually sometimes become a part of the debate here in Muslim societies. Historically, we know that men and women were actually participating in collective religious practices. So they were going to mosques with men. They would stand in separate rows, but they were encouraged to attend these services. But as the time progressed, and I think many also some of the maybe the Islamic scholars sort of refined that practice, and there was a discouragement for women to attend the mosques. And so today in most of the societies, you don't find women going to the places of worship. This is contradictory to the original spirit and original practice. We see them, for instance, if you want to see a little bit of more women participation, the annual event of Eid, which follows after Ramadan, you still find a lot of women participating in those services. But the weekly Friday prayers, you don't find them anymore. There have been some in some countries, for instance, in Malaysia, in Turkey, in Iran, you see maybe separate spaces within the mosques, but by and large, you don't find them participating. So I think that's why you will, it's very hard to find the religious participation of women in Muslim societies in a formal sense.
So if you think about the Hajj, I believe participation is much more uniform by gender. Yeah. Is that correct?
That's right. That's in Hajj, it is very different. And men and women, and actually, you know, you're right. So Hajj has been retained as it was, let's say, over centuries. So the social structure of Hajj and the rituals, nothing has changed at all. So you see, you know, both men and women actively participating, but you don't see it in, let's say, day-to-day religious activities.
Here there is another interesting question from Daniel Chang. Daniel Chang mentioned that in Asia, we have an attempt of unification of the region called ASEAN. And in this region, 45% of the population is Muslim, and it intertwines with Buddhists, Christians, Hinduists, and etc. How is it possible to ensure an harmonious industry development which is inclusive? And I like very much the last part of the question. What are the roles for businesses and financial institutions in their services and human resources development? So in granting an harmonious development, an inclusive development, which takes into account this religious diversity in a region that account for more or less a billion people.
Well, my first reaction is along Adam Smith's lines. I'm sure Robert has, being the economist, he's going to have a more specific response, but the idea would be that short of the respect for liberties and particularly religious freedom within a corporation, again, the context is very difficult. But Adam Smith was a strong advocate of that, and for the flourishing of religion, and I guess one would even have to say human happiness, you have to allow for that individual liberty.
You know, I know in general, and in some of our specific studies, that persecution of minority religious adherents has been quite important. I think Sri Lanka was a case that we looked at and discussed a bit in our book along these lines. That doesn't mean it's an easy matter to have policies that counter this. Now, one of our papers was on the determinants of state religion, trying to predict what would actually be the case in one country or another and at different points in time with respect to whether a state religion would exist. And the number one determinant of that was the concentration of religious adherents in the most popular religion. So if you saw countries where over 90% of the people, for example, were of one faith, the probability of a state religion was very high, more or less independent of which religion this was referring to. Muslim countries tend to have a high concentration in Muslim, and we found that that predicted state religion, which was also very high in Muslim countries. But we also found that if you held constant concentration in the most popular religion, that Muslim versus non-Muslim didn't matter so much anymore in terms of predicting whether a state religion would be present. So that's some indication of the heterogeneity among the population with respect to religion adherence and how it influences state religion. India is an example there. Hindu is the majority religion, but there's a very large representation in other faiths, some of which is Muslim, in fact. And our framework tended to predict that India would not have a state religion, which I think is the case. because there were so much representation in faiths that were not of the most popular religion, that was an important countervailing force in terms of having a kind of government monopoly in terms of religion represented to some extent by state religion. So I hope some of those points are pertinent to the question.
Thank you. Ali, I would address a question to you here on Islamic finance, also because you have touched upon it before, and also Daniel Chang is mentioning that Islamic finance is becoming quite mainstream as a financial offer in Malaysia and Indonesia. And the question is if this could be an obstacle for the non-Muslim nation and community. But I would ask you, because we had this conversation before, to answer this by taking into account also your position on Islamic finance, no? That tends to be an open position in the sense that before you have mentioned these are instruments that are often born in reaction to a different way of doing economics. So there might be some limitation in the tools themselves.
Well, my general understanding, as you rightly mentioned, is a lot of tools and ideas of Islamic finance, emerged in the modern context on this assumption that they can come up with a system of banking free of interest, free of banking interest. So that was the central objective. And if you look at how the Islamic finance work, for instance, a very popular tool of Islamic finance is the leasing and for cars, for houses, and the element of the interest is very much there. So the idea that there's a difference between a cash price and a credit transaction is accepted in all form of Islamic finance instruments. So so I think I do not see that fundamentally different from conventional banking systems. There are some differences. For instance, in the Islamic finance, if you want to pledge, you cannot pledge against monetary assets, for instance. So Pakistan or Malaysian government, if they want to go to a debt market, they would have to pledge, if they're following Islamic finance, they would have to pledge a physical asset as a security to the lenders. So there are these differences, but the element of interest is still very much acknowledged. And one interesting part of the history, which is less known, is that before there were Islamic banks, which is a modern 20th century phenomena, there was actually Muslim banks. And Muslim banks were formed in 18th century and 19th century, following the conventional Western banks, and they were doing very similar transactions. And their objective was more social empowerment of Muslim communities, rather than to bring out an exclusive Islamic alternative to the bank. So if we explain it this sense, I think there are some differences which I believe are important and which can be helpful for financial stability. For instance, this idea of having some kind of hard assets as backup, as security. But then I think that the implicit arrangement is still the admission and acceptance of interest as a tool. Now, my friends who are leading the Islamic economics debate or Islamic finance would never agree with me, of course. They would say, no, they have already done that. And so but this is my own understanding that, look, there's a difference between coming up with an entirely new alternative structure and giving it a different name. And the book which I mentioned earlier, Benedict Kohler, also mentions that even in the Islamic trade and Islamic finance, the tools were being used, which are widely available across the globe, and they were not different. The Muslims were not differentiating in that respect.
Thank you.
Can I say something?
Sure, sure.
There have been a lot of ideas about the role of usury restrictions as a form of credit market intervention that might inhibit investment and economic progress. It's also been used to try to explain why Jews who were not subject to those restrictions did well economically in the money lending business. So that was particularly true in Western Europe. Again, I'm influenced here by Timur Kuran. His idea was that these restrictions are not nearly the most important kind of inhibitions that Islam imposes that matters for economic outcomes, because he thinks, as I understand it, that you can get around a lot of this, as I think is consistent with what Ali was saying. I hadn't thought particularly about the role of mortgages, but given what he was saying about real assets as required collateral, it seems like mortgages would not be inhibited as much as some other things. But again, instead of thinking about credit market restrictions, Timur focused on things about corporate structure, insurance, inheritance restrictions. And I found that convincing. But again, if we're more quantitative, maybe it would be more convincing. But I think that's his argument, which de-emphasizes the traditional discussion about interventions in the credit market, in particular about ability to pay interest.
Okay, I will take the last question before then we go for a final round of conclusions. So in your research, have you faced any evidence of political struggle of the local traditional religions and dominant religion traditions against international financial institutions and or instruments interpreting their development activities as the attempt of enslaving or impoverishing their followers instead of the contrary? If so, have you tried to identify any purely economic rationale behind? Could you elaborate on various religious traditions in this regard? And the author of the question asks if you have in particular a view that regard the Orthodox Christian rationale.
This is a very interesting idea, but I'm afraid it's not one that I've thought about. I've written articles that are critical of international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, but I've never done it on the basis of their discriminating in favor or against different religious traditions. So it's something I would have to think about. I don't really have a good answer to this.
Okay, thank you. And I think because we have been online for almost 2 hours, I would ask first the discussants and finally the authors to give a final thought, and then after them, Anindita, if you want to have a closing remark, and then we will conclude. So, Sergio, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very, very short, and my conclusion is that they have opened a very important questions, and despite religion is a very old tradition, a very old custom, men and women custom, it will be also crucial for the future. And I'm sure we will discuss very much on the impact of religion of economic development and the impact of religion on many aspects of our life. And so my conclusion is that today we have, of course, partially, but we have discussed a very important topics for the future. For this reason, I am very thankful to Robert and Rachel for their contribution. Thank you.
Ali?
Yes, I think I was just thinking, and I'd like to make the statement at the end that we need to differentiate between institutions as human creation and religion as a message from divine, although our understanding of the same message is also human, and therefore all question of interpretation and reinterpretation would always exist. When we try to reform these institutions, which sometimes we got inspiration from religious teaching, I think the problem or challenge is that if we attach sacredness to the understanding of these institutions, then reforms and social evolution of these regulations or rules and institutions become very difficult. So a challenge for us would be to how to separate the sphere of belief in divine and then the sphere of human knowledge and human institutions which we can evolve. Keeping them both is an important, I think, challenge for all of us who are interested in this question of relevance of religion and society.
Professor Barro and McCleary.
Oh, it's on. Well, I think that there's a lot of fertile ground to be researched here in this area. I think that it's very exciting area to do research in, and I think that in terms of our recent work, for example, I'm studying child and youth martyrs in the Catholic Church. And I'm finding that, in fact, the last 3 popes have beatified quite a few child and youth martyrs. So many questions come up in a culture, religion as a cultural mechanism, and what is the purpose of beatifying children as young as 1, going up to 18? That's my span. So in the terms of economics of religion, you have to ask the question, what is the purpose of the mechanism? What's going on here in terms of this? And what is the institution attempting to achieve, particularly the papacy? So they're really interesting questions that you can ask about the economics of religion when you apply market approaches. Is it a matter of competition? Is it a matter of raising adherents within the Catholic Church, making them more passionate about their faith? There are a lot of very interesting questions that you can apply across cultures and across religions.
So let me first say that I've really benefited greatly from the comments, particularly of the 2 discussants. I think there's very valuable ideas there, particularly related to thinking more about Islamic history and also to thinking more about the role of rationality, whether in the religion domain or elsewhere. I think those are 2 important things. In terms of Ali's last comments, maybe something we've done that is pertinent is thinking about institutions as themselves endogenous. And specifically, we tried to apply that reasoning to think about state religions in terms of when they would be formed and whether they would persist or not. We tried to apply a kind of rational choice framework, but adapted to the political choice levels, that is, to the choice of institutions, but that the institutions that were likely to be formed and that would endure had some kind of optimality properties in terms of what the citizenry would like, at least in a context where citizens have some expression of what their interests are. we isolated a number of factors empirically that certainly predict when state religions would exist, and we related that to this framework. One thing I might mention here is there's an incredible endurance of state religion over long periods. And if you look at countries that didn't have major upheavals, like revolutions or breaking up the borders, things like that, the characteristic of state religion hundreds of years in the past still matter and matter significantly. And the Reformation itself is an important example of that in terms of what the current characteristics look like related to what was done back to the 1500s or thereabouts. So I don't know if that fits with what Ali was mentioning, but obviously in our thinking about this particular institution, it involves partly religious elements, which relate to the preferences particularly applied to state religion, and partly to other kind of choice arguments in terms of politics and economic incentives. So it's combining those two types of characteristics into one choice problem.
Thank you. Anindita?
Thank you, Carmelo. As a historian among such noted economists, it is definitely a very engaging session, learned a lot. And I agree with Professor Sergio Noto, who just commented that we have discussed a very important topic for the future. I leave this discussion with many questions in my head. Well, I'll just talk about two very briefly. One of the questions that's in my head is, something that's drawn from the discussion just now. Does secularization of the state tend to sort of lead to lessening of the religiosity of its people? So is there some form of, because here we're talking about state and we're talking about people, so that's a connection that I think I would at some point, probably read more from you. And also, and especially I think I'm thinking in terms of Asian countries, post-colonial countries, which have chosen to have secular constitutions upon nationhood. So that's one. And the other is the religion or religiosity among the diaspora, which is, all over the world. People are really moving. This is the age of, mobility. So the religiosity among diaspora, various religious diasporas, and how this could be harnessed to economic development in the countries that they have adopted. So I think these are the two things among many that I would be very interested to find out more. Perhaps not today, we have run out of time, but moving forward, and I would really like to thank all the speakers for being with us here today. Also to Carmelo, who is an adjunct professor at the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much for this collaboration. Thank you, Carmelo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nindita, and thank you to Taylor for having been a partner for this event. I'd like to thank our speakers for having accepted to be here and to be hosted by our little and young institution that is trying to grow, and the presence of prestigious speakers like you help us to not only to grow, but also help us to give our little contribution to the general discussion on important topics, in particular in the context in which we operate, which is Malaysia. Thanks to Sergio and Ali for having accepted to be the discussants and to have helped to animate the discussion. I think that we all leave this session enriched with answers and questions, and I hope motivated for further investigation, and who knows, maybe for further collaborations in the future. We never know. This, I think, has been among the Center for Market Education does many things. This year we have published I think 3 educational papers and 5 or 6 policy papers. and I have to thank all the people that cooperate, because we do most of these things in a voluntary way. So the organization is run by volunteers, and on this, let me thank Amir, who is behind the camera and helping us with the technical organization. So this has been our fourth webinar, I think, this year. We have discussed green economy and Islamic finance. We have discussed the future of central banking. We have discussed MMT and cryptocurrencies. And tonight, this exciting conversation. We will conclude the year with a last webinar on the 7th of December with a completely different topic, with speakers from Malaysia and Indonesia discussing financial literacy in the fintech area. But you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, all the social media, and where you will find all the information about our future activities. And again, thank you very much. I hope that the speakers, the discussants have enjoyed the discussion as I did. The recording of this webinar will be on our YouTube channel as well. So I will send you the link once it's ready. Hopefully, this webinar will also help to promote the sales of the books. Obviously, is an important part. And again, thank you. Thank you on behalf of all the team of the Center for Market Education. Sergio is showing the cover page of the book, The Wealth of Religions. As Sergio mentioned, a book that open the floor and the discussion for very important and new considerations. And I hope that these I haven't discussed this, but I hope that this multidisciplinary approach will further nourish. And it's true that I mentioned your book as a child of Max Weber, but I see it also in line with what Derd McCloskey is trying to do with the concept of humanomics. So the attempt to have an economic science that work both on very strong quantitative and fundamentals, but also on with the support of qualitative research grounded in philosophy, literature, poetry, and in general social sciences. So I guess that you are also walking in the path of humanomics. And let's keep in touch. Have a good day. It's time for us to go to sleep. And thank you again, and have a wonderful week ahead. Thank you. Thank you
very much. We enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Assalam.
Thank you.
Grazie, Carmelo. Grazie.
Grazie.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Ali. How are you?
Oh, I saw you. I thought, okay, I'll say hello before I leave.
Yes. I thought Camilo was gonna like wait for a while, but seems he forgot to stay.
Oh, that's fine. I think he was a bit tired at the end. It's late in there.
Yeah. How are you, Ali?
Yes, keeping well. Has been a lot of journey for me coming back.
Yep.
And rejoining the think tank, which has become smaller than I left.
Oh, so it's rebuilding it again.
Yeah, that's kind of a bit partly enjoyable, partly painful.
Well,
yeah. So, but I think we are on better grounds than I was at 1 year ago.
Yeah.
So, so most of my time has been spent in. For that mission. And but yeah, also in keeping in touch with the Carmelo and the network, the Islam and Liberty Network is doing well. You probably received some updates about that. And yeah, and that's has been, the book came out, the book which I wrote in Malaysia, most of it, the Islam and Economics book.
Oh, yes. Is it out for sale already?
Yes, it's available on Amazon, so you can order.
Okay.
And so that was something I started. I actually wrote in Malaysia. I think that's the.
That's good. Well, so it's like, are you like 100% of your time is with Prime, or do you have like a side?
No, I do have, like, I distribute time. So Prime, but then also the Islam and Liberty Network.
Right.
And a third dimension is a little bit of my consulting work, which I'm doing for private sector. But it's still